Today we're going to learn a little bit of the history of the Battlefords. I think it's important that we start with the geology of the place. 12,000 years ago, the Wisconsin Glacier covered most of what is Saskatchewan today. As it receded, a glacial spillway formed, and as you can see from this, 11,500 years ago, there was a large glacial spillway that was forming in the Battlefords. I'll fast forward about 1,500 years, and you can see that the North Saskatchewan River was formed. The North Saskatchewan River joins the South Saskatchewan River, and together they make their way off towards Hudson Bay. This is very important when it comes to the glacial spillway and what it led to in the Battleford. Now, the transportation routes were used a lot in Canada. Aboriginals used them to move furs, supplies up and down the rivers. The fur traders came, the voyageurs, the French, the British, used the fur trade routes to get around. Now, the rivers brought fur trading posts, they brought forts, and they brought habitation to this area. And because it was a glacial spillway, the soil is very, very fertile, and so it makes great farmland. And hence, immigrants came and homesteads were developed, so we are a wonderful agricultural area. Well, the buffalo was the main subsistence of the Cree. They followed the buffalo. Where the buffalo went, so went the Cree and the Stonies. The First Nations community, or the First Nations people in this area utilized everything of the buffalo. They used, it was for food. They built their teepees with it. It was their shelter. They used the bones for tools. They used the hide for clothing. And between 1870 and 1880, the buffalo began to disappear. And this started to change the life of the Cree. The whiskey trade had been going on for quite a while, and it was starting to get a little out of control in the southern part of what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan in the Cypress Hills. And the government of Canada at the time organized the Northwest Mounted Police, not the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but the Northwest Mounted Police. The Northwest Mounted Police later becomes the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They were formed in 1873, and they were marched west to stop the whiskey trade. They established a fort at Fort Macleod, and in 1876 they established a post here in Battleford. The Mounties had a very good working relationship with First Nations people. They became Canada's police force in 1919 and were renamed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1920. Along with the Northwest Mounted Police post here, the seat of government was also located in Battleford. It was established in 1876 when Battleford was named the capital of the Northwest Territories. So from 1876 to 1883, we were the hub of Western Canada. Treaty number 6 was also signed in that year, and it is an agreement between Queen Victoria and the Cree and Stoney First Nations. Treaty 6 covers much of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And in the treaty, it's listed that the Aboriginals gave up the land. Now, there's a fundamental difference between Europeans and Aboriginals, is the concept of land ownership. Europeans believe that we can't own the land. And First Nations people believe in the Great Spirit and of the land, and everything is a part of it. With the Aboriginals giving up the land, the government agreed to allocate a portion of land for each band, and they called it reserves. They told the First Nations people that they would give them farming equipment. They would teach them how to farm, and they would provide them seeds to grow. Now, if you remember from the previous slides that the Cree people were used to following the buffalo and using that for their subsistence. Now, they're being asked to become farmers. So they came back and said, well, if nothing grows, if we don't do it, will you feed us? We'll provide you with food. If they got sick, they were provided with medicine. And they were told that they could educate their young. The buffalo began to disappear in this area in 1878. The First Nations communities were starving. Aboriginals and Indian agents do not get along well together. The people that the government hired to teach the Cree people how to farm couldn't speak the language. They couldn't speak Cree, and the Cree couldn't speak English. They did not get along well. The white settlers of the area, the farmers, the immigrants of the area, began being paranoid because the Métis in Batoche, which is east of here, were having a little scrap with the government surveyors over how to survey the land. And there was a little skirmish that took place in Duck Lake in 1885. Duck Lake. The settlers of the area became afraid, and they moved inside Fort Battleford. Chief Poundmaker brought his people to get food to the fort. They were hungry. The Indian agent was not prepared to give them food. In fact, when Poundmaker arrived here, they set up camp outside, and the Indian agent stayed inside the fort. He did not come out to meet with Poundmaker. Eventually, some of Poundmaker's men took it upon themselves and rode into the town of Battleford and took some supplies that they needed. This was known as the Siege of Fort Battleford of 1885. No shots were fired. No one talked. There was no communication at all. Now, the militia from Eastern Canada was afraid that the First Nations people would join with the Métis and Louis Riel in Batoche, and they would become a significant enemy to the government. The militia under the command of Colonel Otter marched towards Battleford, and as soon as they arrived here, they turned west and they started marching towards Cut Knife Hill. There, it was Otter's intention all the way along to go and engage the Cree. They met at the Battle of Cut Knife Hill. It was very similar in design to Little Bighorn, where George Custer of the 7th Cavalry was slaughtered by the Sioux. His position was on top of a hill, just as Otter's was. Poundmaker's men moved freely at the base of the hill, hidden by much brush. They were able to inflict casualties on Otter's men, who fled the hill after a battle. Chief Poundmaker at the time wouldn't allow his men to follow. If Poundmaker had not stopped his men, it could very well have turned out similar to what happened to Custer at Little Bighorn. The Cree defeated Otter, and he prevents his braves from massacring the militia. A little while later, there was a little disagreement that happened in Frog Lake. The disagreement led to the death of about 8 white settlers and businessmen, one of them including an Indian agent by the name of Thomas Quinn, who was murdered by Wandering Spirit. John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of our country, wanted to send a message. So the 8 men, Wandering Spirit, Man without blood, crooked leg, round the sky, bad arrow, miserable man, iron body, and little bear were executed in late November of 1885, around the time that Louis Riel was executed in Regina. This is a satellite image of Fort Battleford. The stockade was replaced in about 1960. It was a birch tree post where you could actually stick your hands through it. It really wasn't much of a fort. After the hanging of the 8 men, they were taken out of the front of the post and they were buried on the side of a hill, which is a very sacred piece of ground today. That's a very quick little story of some of the history today. The signing of 1876 and the formation of reserves in this area has greatly influenced the way we look today. Next time when we start looking at some of the other businesses that we have here, we are going to try to examine what we believe are some of the similarities that make you just like us, and perhaps some of the differences which set us apart. Until next time, thanks for coming.